Many of us know Mr. Arun Shourie in many different ways. He's been a public intellectual and continues to be one. He's been a politician, a minister in government. He's now a vocal critic of this government. But I think above all of these identities, for so many millions of Indians, he is a legend in the world of news media. In particular, for journalists like myself, we've grown up hearing about his years as a path breaking editor, which is why I'm so excited to be speaking to him today about some of the biggest news stories that he had a chance to steer, exposes, missions to hold power to account, and of course his years with Ramnath Goenka of the Indian Express, all captured in a completely anecdotal and colorful way in his memoir just out, a media memoir, as it were, intriguingly titled The Commissioner for Lost Causes. This was the description given to Arun Shourie by Ramnath Goenka, and we're going to hear from him why Mr. Goenka looked at Arun Shourie through that lens. Well, let's welcome Arun Shourie now to the program. Mr. Shourie, it's a great honor and privilege, as always, to talk to you. And like I said, you have many different avatars, but the most exciting one for all of us is your years as editor, as journalist. First, the lovely little story that your book begins with about how Ramnath Goenka basically told you, Arun, you're always chasing lost causes, and that's why you're a commissioner for lost causes. Did you agree with that description by him of you?
No, actually, that's actually in his way of complimenting you. And what happened was that I was just working in my little cabin in the Indian Express, and Ramnaji walked in, and he said, मैं तुम्हारे office के बाहर board लगाऊंगा, the commissioner for lost causes. And the occasion was that we had been pursuing the condition of under trials in jails. We had found that persons had been in jail for 14 years. Somebody who was blind and had gone mad, she was there, or not blind, but she had gone mad. Nobody knew why she is there, but she was there. And the reason for that was not that they had been convicted, but they were waiting for their cases to come up in court. And years had gone by. And many times the time they had spent in jail was a multiple of the times of the maximum punishment they could have been given under the law for the offenses for which they were accused. And he was very happy actually, because in that episode, in that series, it was estimated that because of that series and the judgments of the Supreme Court, almost 40,000 prisoners were released. And he later, of course, said that 80,000 people were released. So it was a way of his complimenting कि अच्छा बहुत अच्छा काम कर रहे हो, मैं ऐसा ही काम रोज करवाऊंगा.
But Aditi Fadnis, I think, writing a review of your book, wrote about how this is a book of about an age of journalism gone past. But before I come to what has changed in journalism, what really struck me reading your book was how often you were sometimes called a pamphleteer. You refer to it in the very opening of the book, and later you talk about how B.G. Verghese, with whom you had some differences, described you as a polemicist turned pamphleteer who changed the norms and the rules of journalism, and not always for the better. How do you see this debate around whether journalists are chroniclers and reporters, or whether they are indeed activists and pamphleteers? It is a question that has become very, very imperative for the kind of polarized times that we live in, and probably a question and a description for you that was ahead of its time when it was first used.
Well, actually, what is wrong with being a pamphleteer? We should not listen to these adjectives. I mean, to take very big names, Thomas Paine was a pamphleteer. And he was there, he was igniting the American Revolution. Lokmanya Tilak would certainly be regarded as a pamphleteer. And what if somebody said Gandhiji is not a politician? Okay, doesn't matter. It is work you should see and not pay any attention to these adjectives which are hurled by various people. I remember many journalists saying this at that time, but okay, so what? And when that work succeeded, they appropriated the work, saying that this is the work This shows the power of the press. So we should not worry about these things.
But
We
you know
should be.
what really leaps out, sir, in the book is how you obviously published stories that made a number of politicians very upset, and they would fight with you, they would argue with you, they would argue with the proprietor of the Indian Express, Ramnath Goenka, and Devi Lal in particular would call you and abuse you and use Ma Behan ki galiyan and so on, and you were still able to stand your ground and still able to publish all of that, including the abuses that had been hurled at you. Do you believe that that time has passed where you could actually disagree with a politician, have a really bad argument with him, but continue to do your work and continue to be able to engage with that politician? I mean, I last remember personally the only politician I can remember that happening with was LK Advani, who would sometimes call me and say, Barkha, I didn't agree with one word of what you said, but ghar aana chai piyenge.
Yes, actually, that's a very great change that has come about. We always look to the changes in the press, but there's a great change among politicians also. A growing intolerance, and these standards are set at the top. At that time, it was a time of Mr. Jayaprakash Narayan on one side. I mean, so many people disagreed with him in his life. Of Panditji, as you are showing now, so many people would not, as he told Shankar, the cartoonist, don't spare me. So it was a time in which there was civility, there was respect for ideas, there was a respect for discourse. Now it is just shouting and screaming on all sides. And when you said about that we can't do this, one of the great differences was that maybe you couldn't do it in many other papers at that time. But with Ramnathji there, you could certainly do it in the Indian Express till he dismissed you.
Yeah, and you're quite proud of the times that you are actually dismissed. And I think there's a moment in the book where you talk about how the moment he said, Chalo Oberoi Hotel jaake khana khate hain, you knew that it was like a lamb to the slaughter moment that was awaiting you. And yet you remember him so fondly. It is rare that a journalist who is dismissed would remember somebody who's been his or her boss so fondly. Explain this very complex relationship that you had with Ramnath Goenka.
Well, actually, I remember him with great fondness and with great admiration. And okay, he removed me because of great pressure from the government at that time. But he is the one who gave us opportunities. He let us do things which no other owner of a newspaper would have done, even at that time. My articles would be excessively long. Our reporter would go and buy a woman, as Ashwini Sareen did. There were so many things. But he just, yes, in the emergency, he stood up like nobody else did. So it is those things that I remember. And the fact that he dismissed me was, well, partly because of the pressure of government, and also because probably the paper was getting too identified with our work of my colleagues and me rather than with him. In his mind, he was the paper. And so there was an element of that, and many people fanned that. Kedi log कहते हैं कि ये गोयनका का पेपर नहीं, ये शौरी का पेपर है, just to, you know,
Yeah.
fan
I
the
think
flame.
I think it's a familiar friction that sometimes develops between proprietors and journalists who become very big
So
legends.
therefore,
As yes,
there's a lesson, if I may just mention that there is a lesson in all persons who are in a position of either ownership or being bosses, that you see, they should be psychologically secure, so
yes.
that they should be very careful in the subordinates whom they choose. But once they choose them, they must let them do their best, and also, I mean, he supported us, but you let them do their best and don't be jealous about them. People are going to know that it's because of you that the work is being done. I know this. There was one contrast between Ramnathji and, say, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Mr. Vajpayee was psychologically much more secure, and therefore he trusted you completely. And
Yeah.
Ramnathji would let you do all the things, but always have in his mind
An
a
insecurity that
reservation. Yes.
you would overshadow him. But
No, not we can't. Small little fellows like I can't overshadow him. But somehow that was a thing that was may have been in his mind.
there's a lot to unpack in your memoirs, but before I take you back to some of those big stories of your time, I want to ask you for an appraisal of how you look at journalism in India today. And I ask you this because your book ends with a kind of ready lessons for those who might feel beleaguered. And one of the arguments you make is don't be terrified of losing your platform, because if you have to compromise on what you want to say, you've already effectively lost your platform. And you'll find another way to tell what you have to. If it's not newspapers, it'll be TV. If it's not TV, it'll be YouTube. If it's not YouTube, you'll find another way. How do you look at the state of journalism today when so many of India's sort of best known journalists have actually left what used to be once called mainstream media?
So I think there is a great thing, a great reason to be concerned about mainstream media, because other than one channel, let's say NDTV, I don't see others doing any work of any consequence at all. We actually only now, because of my wife's illness, we have a television in the house. We don't have it otherwise.
Yeah.
And secondly, in the newspapers also, in the mainstream newspapers, the Indian Express does something good occasionally, so that's worth reading. But otherwise, I don't read any other paper at all, frankly. And but there are many reasons for hope, I think. One is that outside what you call the mainstream media, individuals, and you personify them, that you people are doing path-breaking work which was never done before. Just with a camera and a mic, the way Praveen Jain of the print with his just camera in his hand, you exploded the lies of the government in regard to COVID. It is it's a historic work.
Thank you,
You have
sir.
documented,
Thank you.
yes,
Thank
you
you.
have documented history in that case. I think the only paper that did that was Dainik Bhaskar, but nobody else did that. So also, there are individuals, small groups of individuals, who are doing outstanding work in what mainstream media should be doing. To give an example, Sucheta Dalal and her husband Devashish, the way
Yes.
they follow the financial institutions in money life is just wonderful. The way a small little group based in Ahmedabad of all places works on alt news is just remarkable. A small group, or I don't even know who they are individually, but who follow assaults on free speech under the group called Article 14. That's wonderful. I mean, these are things that were not known at that time at all. So,
Yeah.
so there's been a very creative response in society, I think, of outside mainstream media. The growth of comics in India.
Yes.
I don't think there's an editorial writer who can have the impact that the comics have, like this Rajiv Dhawan. I don't know who he is, but on YouTube, his little 5 minute, 3 minute things are incisive. They tear down or they pierce the armor of many a politician and government. So I think there is a creative response in that respect. The second thing I think is that that's not so much in the media, but in the world of discourse, that so many persons now, like former civil servants, former diplomats, are writing. So many of them. At that time, let's say Mr. V.P. Menon had written, Mr. V. Shankar had written, or Mr. H.M. Patel's former civil servants had written, and they had written more or less very sedate books. But now we have books by Shiv Shankar Menon on national security. We could not be better educated than by somebody like him, or by Mr. Shyam Saran on various aspects of Indian foreign policy. My senior in college, Chandrasekhar Das Gupta's outstanding book on Bangladesh, this Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin, whom none of us would have heard about, working for 30 years in the Foreign Office archives. His 5 volumes on Indian Chinese diplomatic relations and the book that he has done summarizing the lessons from that period and those documents. Um, I remember Mr. Sidhu, who was in Raw, writing about this, how this Khalistan bogie was built up. There was
Yeah.
none. So this is very great and wonderful development for public discourse. So maybe we should think of media as not a great participant in public discourse, and we should see what is happening in public discourse as such. Then
Well,
we'll be
I'm
more hopeful.
I hope that your reasons for hope remain valid, because one of the things that's happening is that there is now a move to curtail this digital space, which is where a lot of these independent voices are trying to find space. And thank you for your comments on our work. It means a lot coming from you. But let me ask you this, Mr. Shourie. You made a transition from being a journalist, from being an editor, to being a politician. You're not the first senior media person to have made that transition. Do you think there's a certain natural transition from being in journalism to being in politics? Or do you look back at it and think you wish you hadn't?
Not really. I was unemployed. And this is just like it is getting another forum. And now that I'm not in government or anything, I write books. So actually, one should look at one's work,
Yeah.
and these are platforms. Barkha was a very important figure on a mainstream channel. Okay, that's not available. She's become an exceedingly important figure just by herself. I'm sure that everybody who saw your work during the COVID crisis would say that this is an institution, like that Tina Brown was saying. You are a heroine. Uh,
Thank you,
so,
sir.
so I think we should look at these things as just a platform that's available for the time being. And actually, I've counseled there also that have 2, 3 professions going at the same time. Okay, you're not allowed to be a journalist, then write books. You're not allowed to write books, something else. So that should be a good thing to remember for the future. And and don't look upon yourself. We should not become our jobs. We must do our work. And if I
Yeah.
may be, please don't think that I'm being advertising myself or anything like that. But I'll give you a lesson I was taught. You see, I was in Mr. Bajpayee's government, and I had to take a flight to Assam or something, and I was standing in the queue for the security check. I did not like to go through something. I just stood in the queue. So when my turn came, the person started, checking me. So somebody said, his superior said, "Oh, छोड़ो छोड़ो, वो Arun Shourie minister है, minister है." So that fellow said from Haryana, he said, "ये minister है?" ओए नहीं नहीं, ये Arun Shourie है. And he said to me, then he turned to me and he said, "Shourie साहब, ये हमेशा याद रखना. हम आपकी पहचान हमारे लिए मिनिस्ट्री शिस्ट्री नहीं है. हम जब कॉलेज में थे तो आपके आर्टिकल पढ़ते थे." It was a
Correct.
lesson. You see, in
Correct.
India, too many people become just their jobs or their positions, and those jobs go and their positions go, and then they subside like froth.
Yeah, let's turn back to the book. It describes the Bofors years. It describes how you exposed A.R. Antulay when he was Maharashtra chief minister. There's so much in there. But when you look back, and of course you've spoken already about how you may have had a role in stopping Gyani Zail Singh from acting against Rajiv Gandhi. But when you look back, what to you was that moment in your journalism that you feel the proudest of? Like for me, in some ways, my last 2 years almost felt to me like my first 2 years in journalism. It was like I remembered what I had become a journalist for. You sometimes that a story or an issue does that for you. What do you look back, sir, that you're proudest of in your many decades in news media?
No, firstly, about this business about Gyaniji trying to dismiss or setting out to dismiss Rajiv Gandhi, please, this is a construction of our mutual friend Karan Thapar. I have never claimed, I have never said, the book does not say, and
Yes.
I'm glad that you brought it up so that I can say this, that
Yeah.
he has put this construction that maybe Arun Shourie says, maybe I stopped. No, no, bhaiya, we are nobody. Gyaniji may well have been, as the book makes out, the person closest to him, Tarlochan Singh, said कि नहीं, ज्ञानी जी दी पॉलिसी दूजी सी, ज्ञानी जी दी पॉलिसी सी, मारो नहीं, तरीको, don't kill a man, don't hit a man, frighten him.
Yeah.
So maybe this elaborate drama which Gyaniji did, including contacting people who might be ready to replace Rajiv Gandhi, getting letters drafted, saying all this in front of his subordinates, the military secretary and so on when I entered, maybe that was all part of a great drama that he was doing so as to make sure that Rajiv Gandhi is frightened enough and then thereby does not conceal or does not hold back the information that he should. Of course, Gandhiji used to tease me. Always when I met him later, he would embrace me and he would say, "Kabhi adha kasoor tera
Well,
So
you know,
I don't think that would not be fair at all. And
okay,
please, I would
okay,
request
okay.
even Karan to change his headline. Please don't.
Well, good luck. Good luck with getting Karan to change the headline. But let's focus on what I asked you. What in this massive mammoth body of work leaps out at you? Do you feel the most attached to?
Well, I feel most attached to my colleagues of that time. You know, they are the bonds that were made, for instance, in school, have lasted us for 60 years, maybe 70 years now. And similarly, the bonds that came about during the Indian Express were have lasted all this period. I'm sure that if when I am in trouble or in need, and I ring up anybody who we worked together in the Indian Express, just as in government, then or in school, I'm sure they would go out of their way to help me at that time. So it is the collegial feeling that the paper that developed during all these episodes. These were intense episodes, and sometimes they involved very small, 3, 4 individuals or 2, 3 individuals only. Therefore, the bonds were even stronger. So that is
How?
what the
How?
individual stories I don't quite remember, but I remember, for instance, I think at that time the analysis of judgments was not quite done,
Yeah.
and certainly not at the type of length to which I am accustomed. So, getting into a tussle with such an eminent judge like Justice P.N. Bhagwati, or get all these privilege motions being assessed by such a distinguished judge like Justice Hidayatullah, because he was the vice president at that time, and combating those was, I think, that lives in my mind quite a lot
Let
because
me
I
ask
like
you.
reading documents and all. So
Yes.
that was
Let me
yes.
let me ask you this. You know, we live in a time when politics has broken friendships. It's created fights within families. At least these days, usually conversations around the dining table end with, "Acha, let's not talk politics." You write about how, during the Bofors expose, where you are taking on Rajiv Gandhi, but there's also Suman Dubey, who's your brother-in-law, who is, of course, close to Rajiv Gandhi, and you talk a little bit about the pain of that disagreement, and Suman basically then saying, "I can't be part of this." How did you learn as a journalist to separate the personal from the political? And I asked you this question because it is really a question for our times today. I think in your time, you all managed to do it. Today, it's almost impossible. It would be very rare, for example, to find a Modi critic and a Modi admirer being really close friends.
See, that perversity has been introduced by the politicians.
Yes.
There is no civility. You mentioned Advaniji, or you mentioned Mr. Bajpayee came up in the conversation. I mean,
Yeah.
forget people like Mr. Jayaprakash Narayan, but these conventional politicians, or Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde, any one of them, I think even Chaudhry Devilal or certainly Gyaniji, everyone, you could certainly go to them. In fact, they would call you and they would say कि भी ये ठीक था, ये नहीं था, and you could say कि सर मेरे से शायद गलती होगी मगर मेरे राय में ये था, आपकी राय में दूसरा है, and he would they would not hold it against you, or at least they would. So I think there is a great change in the civility among politicians. There may be a good reason for that. The reason is that the politicians of today are really ruthless fellows, many of them. They may get votes, but they have not come through life and struggle the way those people had come. I mean, I'm sure that I think that's the point. That many of them would be just because they've been picked up by somebody, patronized, and suddenly they are puffed up by their office. I don't think that those politicians were puffed up by their office. They knew that आज ये हैं कल नहीं होंगे.
So you provocatively once, I remember, called the Modi government, I think in its first tenure, just like the UPA plus cow. If you had to describe this government today, would that tagline remain constant, or would it have altered by now?
It will be the cow plus something else, but certainly not the Congress. So it is no, because I think there is a very great difference, Barkha. It was not evident in the first year or so of Mr. Modi, and that difference is that they are working to an agenda, and I was trying to alert people to that agenda, but people. But now it is clear that they are working to a great agenda, an agenda set in the and declared in the 1940s and 50s. They say we जो हम कहते हैं वो करते हैं. मुश्किल ये है that we people have not paid attention to कि वो क्या कह रहे थे और इसलिए वो क्या करेंगे. I'll give you an example. You see, we have to learn, we have to decipher these techniques of theirs. A stray statement is made. It is repeated 3-4 times. Then some institution says it, and 2 years later, it is actually brought into being. Say, Mr. Modi says, we must have simultaneous elections. You think he's trying to save money? You think that he is wanting कि इतना time जो ज़ाया होता है when you can't then take big decisions, वो उसको ज़रा compress कर दे. Otherwise, there's always some election going on or the other. No. And then he says it once or twice, then other people say it, and then suddenly somebody from the election commission says, yes, in 2024, we will be ready to hold simultaneous elections. Now, if you go back to 1949, when the constitution was being finalized, one of the most doggedly, one of the strongest criticisms that was made by the RSS of the constitution, by Mr. Golwalkar, let us say, was that ये जो union of states बनाया है ना, ये बिल्कुल अमेरिका से कॉपी करके बनाया है इन्होंने, फेडरेशन ऑफ स्टेट, बिल्कुल नहीं. We must have a unitary government. States should be run as departments of the central government. अच्छा ये जो डबल इंजन ग्रोथ चल रही है, ये डबल इंजन को सिंगल इंजन कैसे बनाया जाए सारी कंट्री के लिए. And you will see in retrospect many years from now that this business of simultaneous elections was the first step towards that. The spreading the hegemony of the BJP all over. That is, of course, in effect, it brings about one government. But otherwise, especially with a centralized government, a centralized party like the BJP. But otherwise, it is this fact of simultaneous elections. Then the election will then be presidential. And nobody else would have been allowed to build a profile as high and big and vast as, let us say, Mr. Modi now. So please, there is a great difference now and between when the government came to office, and certainly with the Congress. The Congress is almost without an agenda. It was working, on an agenda set by in the 1920s and 30s. But in governance, there was not an agenda of the structural kind. Now there is an agenda for that. This
So
Hindu Muslim
sorry,
this Hindu
go ahead.
Muslim divide, this marginalization, addressing only one part of the whole people of India, and that then becomes your base for doing everything else for legitimacy.
Hmm.
But all this has been written down, spoken many, many times. I'll give you an example. Because of some work I was doing, some reading I was doing, I surveyed about 10 books on written in the 1970s and 80s on secularism in India, the dangers to secularism. I tell you, Barkha, not one of those books or essays refers to the primary literature of the RSS. The RSS is presented in some as a Hawa, especially after the this you call demolition of the Babri Masjid. Oh, great threat! But वो systematically एक चीज कह रहे हैं, उसको कोई पढ़ता ही नहीं था उस समय, हमने भी नहीं पढ़ा था. So they are really acting to an agenda, and we should, even at this late hour, wake up to it.
And what is that agenda in one line? Is it to change the structure and organization of how power is arranged in India? What is
No,
that agenda?
it is what they have always said, to establish a Hindu Rashtra. It is the phrase occurs uh, countless times in everything which they have said. And now this business of redefining the Hindu and so on is there. Kisaba, anybody born here, anybody born this side of this Hindu, this, nothing like that. No, no. You take a small thing. I think it was at the time when the Prime Minister was inaugurating that hologram of Subhash Chandra Bose on that canopy near India Gate. He said कि हमारा राष्ट्र तो हजारों साल पुराना है, and went on. Now look at the implications of that. That's a phrase that is repeated again and again and again by the great leaders of the RSS, by the strong leaders of the RSS. Implication one of the implications is कि उसके बाद जो मिलावट हुई ना, वो अपने राष्ट्र की नहीं है, वो मिलावट है. That is one point. But second, a small point there, कि क्योंकि हमारा राष्ट्र हजारों साल पुराना है, इसलिए ये गांधी जी को फादर ऑफ द नेशन कहने का कैसे बात बनी? How is he the father? You see, because Panditji is not the problem for the present government and for this whole agenda, but Gandhiji is a problem. And therefore, the erasure of Panditji is the preliminary step towards the erasure of Mahatma Gandhi.
Why has the opposition then?
the
Why has there not been able to be? You've been a journalist, you've been a storyteller, you've been an editor. You know as well as anybody does that you can only counter an idea with a better idea, or as compelling an idea. Where is that compelling idea from the anti-Modi political space? Why is it absolutely missing?
Well, because people are not doing their work. And firstly, we have to recognize the idea of the other person. Of course, you must alert people to what his idea is and what its consequences will be, but you have to do some work about an alternate idea. You can't keep just telling Barkha, you should think of an alternate idea. Everybody must do some work. You said about the political idea, political parties. Which is the political party that is doing any work? The communists used to do the work intellectually. They had a whole phalanx in the universities and so on that is doing that kind of work. They are now nowhere. So this is a serious matter, and please do not underestimate the role of ideas. So we should work on ideas, on evidence. And we should look at the implications of what the other person is saying for the idea that is behind that thing.
Let me ask you, in the end, what the ideas that you talk about. This is a long haul conversation, but as you said, what is interesting is everything the BJP wants to do under Mr. Modi, they've actually spoken about, and sometimes the rhetoric is ignored as mere rhetoric. But I think the point you're making is it's not only rhetoric. Let me end with a question about your book. As you said in the beginning, when Ramnath Goenka called you the commissioner for lost causes, he meant it as a compliment. But is there any part of your life that you actually look at as a lost cause? And would you call journalism a lost cause today?
Yes, as you said, a long haul question. In my life, journalism is not important. It's the condition of our son, the illness of my wife for the last 30 years. That's important. And for brain injuries, for Parkinson's, there has not been a cure in my lifetime. And that is certainly a cause which would be lost even when I die, unless some miracle happens and somebody does some genetic work. But yes, those are important for me. Journalism, हो सकता है country में हो रहा है नहीं हो रहा, but for the time being, it does seem to me that we should not look to the mainstream media to defend democracy, to defend plurality, to to ensure accountability. Just imagine if the Barkha Dutt work had been done by the mainstream work on COVID deaths. I cannot imagine that the results in UP would be the same.
I mean,
You
we
see, you
don't
have
know
to.
that. We
No,
don't
well, I
know
don't know.
that
No,
because there's
yes,
a
you are right.
yes.
You are right because in elections, many factors come into play, but it would have made a difference, much greater difference than one solitary person on a motorbike or behind a motorbike going and seeing these bodies floating.
Yeah.
So I personally feel, yes, look upon the mainstream media, just switch it off. As Balasaheb Thackeray used to say, the remote is in your hands. Don't look at their channels. Don't subscribe to their newspapers. Look around and find the persons who are doing good work, individuals or small little groups, and do whatever you can to assist them. And also, as individuals, you can start collecting the evidence. For instance, that car mows down farmers in
Yeah.
that it's
Lakhimpur Kheri,
yes.
yes.
So was it done by a journalist or a mainstream
No.
media? No, somebody with the phone was taking that video. How important? That's what a good lesson it is. Then we are
Yeah.
so many people with phones, and each of us can become a journalist. Each of them will find a way to get that information out in the public arena. Yes, the government will always try to suppress such information, but this is a cat and mouse game. It has always been about people who disseminate information and people who are hurt by that truth.
One of the loveliest little stories in your book is when Ramnath Goenka tells you that when a storm comes, if the big trees sometimes fall, but वो जो छोटे छोटे घास के clumps होते हैं वो थोड़ा सा झुक जाते हैं और जब storm चला जाता है वो फिर सीधे खड़े हो जाते हैं. So that's a lovely life lesson, sir.
But you have to remember, in Ramnathji's case, he had an aphorism like that and a Sanskrit stroke for either way. Sometimes to stand firm and sometimes to bend a little bit.
But it's true that you have to pick your battles and you have to live to fight
Yes,
another day. I think that was the import of what he was trying to perhaps say.
and to stand by all those who are fighting lonely battles. We
Yes.
must be a fortress around good people. Each of us must be a small fortress among people doing good work,
Well, sir,
like
all
you.
I can say is that, one of the things you remind us of that we can all be chroniclers of our time, and you have been a chronicler of our country for so many decades, hence your memoir, The Commissioner for Lost Causes. Please do read it. It doesn't matter whether you agree with Arun Shourie politically or not. If you're interested in this country, in our democracy, in the issues before us, in the news media, and the history of some of the biggest stories of our time, do pick up Arun Shourie's book. Mr. Shourie, as always, a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.